There we go.
All right. Steve Babson joins the program, author of a cool book we're going to talk about for the next bit here. Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and about your book a little bit?
Okay. My wife and I have lived in Detroit the last 40 plus years, actually in the same house, which makes this kind of a rare thing in America.
Yeah.
I used to work at the Wayne State University Labor Studies Center. I've been a member of the American Federation of Teachers, active in that union, active in the labor movement. My wife worked for the United Auto Workers. We're both retired. We've remained active politically and things like the housing movement, our neighborhood association, and so on.
Nice. Actually, I have a question about the auto workers a little bit later, so that's cool that you have a connection to there.
And I'm going to talk to you about Detroit a little bit. I live there briefly. It's got a fond spot in my heart, especially the Tigers.
Yeah. All
right. I loved your book. Before we dive into it and all our questions, I would just say to our listeners, it's a very digestible book. You're going to get a lot out of it. It's, I was able to read it in 2 settings, and I'm a bad reader. I just get sleepy when I start reading, and I didn't feel that way when I was reading it. There was a lot of information, and it tells a good story. So, and in a way, on something that you felt like you knew, which is the point of any good book you haven't read, is it tells you about something maybe you thought you knew, and new light on it, perhaps.
A lot more details than you probably knew previously.
Yes, sure. Yeah. Yes. Well, and a lot of it has to do with the way the history has been rewritten by the people that, as the victors goes. So I'd say one takeaway from the book that I noticed is I would say it's fair to say you're attempting to recover the term populist. I don't know. Did we say it? Forgotten populist? Did you say that, Alan?
Yeah. Let's talk about the title of the book.
Yeah.
It's Populists, when farmers turned left to save democracy.
Yep.
Right.
Either in your book or in another interview, I heard you describe populism as a political movement demanding the government to align themselves with the majority as opposed to serving the oligarchs. You can use that as a starting point, or you can just dive right into, recovering the term as much as you feel like. We'll have other questions, but maybe broad strokes.
Well, I'm not necessarily in favor of recovering the term. I'm in favor of actually finding a term that matches the needs of the moment and the movements that I would trust to bring about positive change for working people. And the Populists was actually the People's Party back in the 1890s. Their official name was the People's Party, but they had a sort of nickname for themselves. They called themselves the Populists. And what they were calling for in the 1890s, and this was farmers, this was coal miners, this was railroad workers, small towns, rural areas, some cities as well. They were at a moment in American history where the Civil War in the 1860s had produced a new class of extraordinarily powerful corporate executives, the robber barons of that era. And initially, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party gave them a carte blanche, fill out the check in any size you care to, as long as it's payable to the politician that you're trying to bribe. And it was a period of massive fraud, and they called them the robber barons for good reason, because they were involved in numerous schemes for actually bilking consumers, screwing over workers, and augmenting their already substantial power. So I'm talking about railroad corporations, the steel corporations, Jay Gould, Andrew Carnegie, Vanderbilt, that whole range of folks who had come to power at a point where both the Democrats and the Republicans officially were in favor of what's called small government, meaning no government, no regulation, no intervention on behalf of the needs of the majority, and instead allowing simply these wealthy folks to run the country on their own behalf and for their own profit.
When you say that and you talk about the railroads, I think of the examples that you mentioned in the book of double billing, getting public land the size of Texas just gifted to the railroad companies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually initially the public was very much in favor of railroad construction. So for many farmers in particular in isolated rural areas, they saw this as a way of getting their crops to market. And so initially there was a lot of public support for the subsidies that would encourage railroads to build their lines through the particular town or state that was providing the upfront money, and they would pay them by the mile. Federal government, in particularly, starting with the Civil War, would pay them by the mile for constructing railroads, would give them tax breaks, tax exemptions, free land, 170 million acres, and you mentioned it, that's the equivalent of the size of Texas. The idea was that the railroads would then sell that land to settlers, and that would help fund and finance the construction of the railroads. The case of fraud that you mentioned was the best known case was called Credit Mobilier. They adopted a French name for a company that was founded by the owners of the railroads that were being subsidized, but they secretly bought up the companies that were actually being contracted to lay the rails. So as the owners of those contractors, they told the contractor to double the price because after all, the taxpayer would be paying for it. This was revealed, and also the network of bribes that had brought it about. And it was characteristic of a time in which the robber barons, this new class of corporate oligarchs, really had free reign and did as they pleased, buying off politicians when they needed to in both parties. They were bipartisan in that regard. And what the Populists said was, listen, with these railroads were built with public resources, with tax breaks, with subsidies, with the fraud that built taxpayers for additional funds, with free land. So if we built these massive incorporations of railroad power, why wouldn't they then be public resources? If the private owners of them are going to abuse the people who subsidize them, why shouldn't the public take over the railroad and run it for the public benefit? Likewise, why should the banks be allowed to bilk people with extraordinarily high levels of interest when, in fact, through the post office, we could provide 2% loans instead of the 10, 15, 20% loans that were characteristic? Even higher in the South, by the way, where farmers were paying 40 to 50% and higher interest to the furnishing man and the merchants and the local mortgage companies that were lending people money at these extortionist rates. So the Populists were saying, let's have the post office lend people money at rates they can afford. Let's have the government regulate railroads. And if the railroads won't actually operate on behalf of public need, then maybe the public should take over the resources that they financed in the first place. And with companies like Carnegie Steel, later U.S. Steel, why shouldn't the government actually regulate what these companies are doing and make sure that they're not simply operating a de facto monopoly on behalf of profiteering by a tiny percentage of the population that was benefiting off of this kind of lax laissez-faire, as they call it, another French term meaning let the rich do what they please, and somehow that'll trickle down. And it was not trickling down, not in any case in any healthy and positive way. So in fact, the Populists were about saying we need a government that will actually represent the people, and they wanted to expand democracy to make sure that that was going to be the case. They wanted to expand voting rights. They wanted women to be able to vote. They wanted to protect the votes of black farmers in the South in an alliance with white farmers in the South. They wanted election of U.S. senators. At that time, U.S. senators were appointed by state legislatures that were simply responding to the highest bidder of who wanted the job. So the Populists were about democracy and about majority rule on behalf of a new industrial economy that they welcomed, but they wanted access to it.
When you talk about, Alan, I want to let you go. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I have like 4 other questions that I want to ask you just based off that. But when you talk about how they gave the election of senators down to the people, that was almost the seeds of their own undoing, right? Because the people rigged the votes, the white people rigged the votes, and you can tie that directly to the decline of black voting in the South, right?
Well, that was later. Actually, the Jim Crow, as they call it, the system by which African Americans were systematically denied the vote and terrorized into silence, at least for a time. That system begins with the crushing of the populist movement in the South. The populists in the South initially win support from a sizable number of black voters. There were still quite a few black voters who felt a loyalty and an alliance with the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. This was only a couple decades after the end of the Civil War. So there was still that traditional loyalty. but more were breaking away from the Republican Party and joining a populist party. And the white supremacists who ruled the South, they saw this as extraordinarily dangerous and a threat to their rule. By the way, the election of senators didn't happen until 1918.
Okay,
so it can't account for Jim Crow. Jim Crow was the terroristic, violent suppression of the populists. That's what established Jim Crow in the South. And of course, the defeat of Reconstruction 15, 20 years earlier had set the stage for it, but it was a two-stage process of suppressing the black vote in the South.
Alan, I better let you go.
You talk in the book about how different the economy was at that point than it is now. Post the Civil War, the nation was industrializing, but you still had like nearly half the population were farming. And then you see this sort of wealth gap start to be created here. And the people who have the money and the power utilize that to really push people out, to really, they charge more than they should for moving farmers' goods to market, things like that, the huge interest rates people are paying. And so, so these people woke up and they're like, hold on a second, nobody's representing us. Doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat, they're all corrupt. And so they decide to make a third party. Can you talk about why that was, a useful thing to do then, whereas we see third parties as so, they don't function as well in our current political.
Well, they don't work so well here because we have a voting system in which is winner take all, as opposed to a parliamentary system in which power is appropriated as coalitions can find a majority through piecing together lots of different interests and smaller voters, smaller vote totals, to then select a coalition prime minister.
Right.
Here, we vote directly for the executive, and it's winner take all. And so third parties tend to be at an extraordinary disadvantage, particularly because we have a huge country. This is not Luxembourg or Monte Carlo. This is a continent. And so organizing a third party challenge to establish two-party systems is very difficult. One reason they had to do it in the 1890s is that there was no primaries at that time for selecting a presidential candidate. There was no way in which an alternative dissident voice within either the Republican or the Democratic Party could effectively raise their voice and find a widening support within the party. They selected their candidates at conventions that were run by the incumbent established leadership, and they made certain that they marginalized any dissident voice. They couldn't always control the outcome, but often enough they could, more often than not. And so starting a third party was extraordinarily difficult. It was the only option, though, in the 1890s, because there was no system of primaries, except in the South, where they had white primaries, where African Americans were not allowed to vote within the party primaries. And so there would be the occasional white primary in the South, but that was it. And by the way, there was no secret ballot in most of the country. In most of the country, you went to vote with your own, you would write out who you favored, or you would walk into the voting place with what they called the ticket that was handed out by the different parties. And you would simply take the yellow or the red or the blue form of the particular candidate that you were favoring, and you would drop that colored ticket into the ballot box. Well, if you had previously been told that either you vote for the Democratic Party and that colored ticket is what we expect you to drop in the box, and if you don't, we're going to burn your barn down and we're going to deny you credit, and you might physically be in some danger. So that was the way in which the vote was terrorized, and very often people would be driven to the polls by plantation owners who would round up all of their workers, take them into the polling place, give them the ticket that they were supposed to vote, and they would drop it in the ballot box. It was extraordinarily corrupt, and that's how they managed to actually for many years control what was happening in the South. A lot of this was established during Reconstruction, and then the final touches were applied in the late 1890s as they suppressed the populist movement and enforced a whites only, in effect, political system in the South.
I think when to the tragically uninformed, I think they might hear a lot of this and say, well, that sounds like socialism. This is what we fought the Koreans over, or whatever. And we can get to that. I actually have a question regarding the mid-century name change issues, but we'll get to that. You go out of your way to say, no, they wanted to fight capital with capital. This was democracy. And you talked a little bit about the post office and the loans earlier. That was a part of the sub-treasury plan, right?
The sub-treasury plan, right. And that was an interesting approach. The populists were saying, well, there's very little credit available at an affordable interest rate to farmers in the South or in the West. And as you asked earlier, at this point, 1990, 43% of the population is either farmers or farm workers. The percentage today is less than 2%. So we're talking about a very different kind of economy. And what the populists wanted to do was establish a way in which farmers are extremely credit dependent. Because if you think about it, it's different for dairy and truck farming, but for corn and wheat and cotton, you collect your harvest and you get that one huge infusion of payment at the point of harvest. Of course, everybody's bringing their crop for sale at the point of harvest, so there's a glut in the market, and the farm price is extremely low. And if you are actually up to your eyeballs in debt, you got to sell it at that low price because you got bills to pay. And so what the sub-treasury plan was, it said that the government would build warehouses where farmers could bring their crop at harvest, corn, wheat, cotton, and they would get a warehouse receipt for the crop that they put in the warehouse. And they could then take that receipt and use it as collateral for getting a 2% interest loan, not paying 40 and 50%, but 2%. And the government would be protected by the holding of that receipt. If the farmer couldn't repay the loan, the government would get the crop. This, by the way, was the system that was finally implemented in the 1930s. It's called the Commodity Credit Corporation. And a lot of what happened in the New Deal in the 1930s, if you look back, boy, the legacy of the populists looks alive and well in the 1930s when the social safety net was established, often enough hearkening back to some of the precedents that the populists had established for what that was about. So the sub-treasury plan was a practical plan, and it worked in the 1930s. That's what helped rural America recovery, providing affordable credit with the actual resource that farmers possess, their crop. They could put it in the warehouse and wait for prices to recover from the glut of the harvest, and then be able to actually pay off those loans. Whereas in the South, it was called the crop lien system, meaning the merchant or the plantation owner who loaned you the money at 40, 50, 60% for food, for seed, for utility, for farm utilities and tools and such. They would lend you that money. You needed that credit because you hadn't yet actually even planted the crop. And so this was about was actually giving them a way of actually paying off that debt in an equitable manner at an affordable price without being driven to the margins by these extraordinarily extortionist levels of interest.
Right. You talked about how inclusive the movement was. They really understood that regardless of skin color or gender, people that were in this fight were in it together, and that if they were going to be successful, they had to unite. They were successful, and I think getting women the right to vote in a couple of states early on.
Colorado and Idaho, those were the first two states to have votes for women. It was in the 1890s, and in both cases, it was because of the populists. That was their platform in those state races. And across the country, the populist parties, most of them adopted support for votes for women. This is, of course, several decades before the federal legislation was initiated to change the Constitution and establish the right for women to vote. This was at state level, and it was populists who initiated it and successfully implemented it in the first two states to have votes for women.
Seems like everybody should know that, but I think very few people do.
Right, especially these days when the term populist is used to describe everyone and their mother. I mean, right now, if you think about it, over the last many years, 4 or 5 years, I've been, collecting these moments. Bernie Sanders is described as a populist. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump is described as a populist. Joe Biden is described as a populist. And catch this. Benjamin Netanyahu described as a populist. I mean, Don't people get the clue here? It's a meaningless term that's used by people for a whole range of reasons. In some cases, it's just the naive and the well-intended. They think it gives the appearance that they know something. When in fact, if you pin people down, what does it mean? What is a populist? They're all over the map, usually with psychological and sociological terms that have nothing to do with the historical reality of who the populists really were.
Oh, we've walked right into that propeller on this show before. I've been like, well, this guy's a populist. And the reason is, oops. Like, yeah,
right.
really helpful.
What's the reason? Usually what it comes down to is the people who use the term more often than not are people who don't like whoever it is they're talking about. Mm-hmm. Populism sort of suggests not quite trustworthy, maybe a little reckless.
I feel like
they're anti-elitist. And if you're pro-elite, you probably distrust anyone, whether on the right wing or the left wing. And you're inclined to say, well, hey, they're populists. That's not quite right. They're not part of the consensus of responsible elites who are trying to run the economy.
Is it right to lump it in with like a leveraging of the mob, so to speak?
That's a lot of times what's implied is that this is mob rule. And it's interesting to me because actually the thing about the populists is that they were sticklers about parliament, constitutional proceeding.
Yeah.
In favor of the law, in favor of the political process. They actually supported unions, but they constantly were telling unions, hey, strikes are not the best way to go. That kind of direct action is unpredictable, and who knows where it's going to lead. They would support workers on strike, but they would counsel them, drop the strike and come with us and impose our will through the ballot box, through democracy, through the rule of the majority. That was their argument. They were not into mob rule and never were. There was not a single mob event that the populists organized. There was moments like the March on Washington, Coxey's Army, as it was called. And Coxey was a Pennsylvania quarry owner and a populist leader. And this is in a recession. It's actually a depression, a depression. The 1893-1894 depression, in which the unemployment rate went well over 20%. And people are starving. People are starving. There is no social safety net. There's no unemployment insurance. There's no Medicare. There's no Medicaid. There's no Social Security. There's nothing in the way of a social safety net. And the populists are the first to say there should be something to prevent starvation. That if we cannot count on the private sector to provide employment, then the government has many needs that need to be met. In the case of Coxey, what he called for was, let's build some roads. The road system in the United States sucks. Let's invest some money to make good roads that will provide employment for people who are otherwise facing starvation, eviction, homelessness. Let's do something to actually protect them. And that's what Coxey was about. They marched on Washington. It was a peaceful march. Coxey was arrested for stepping onto the lawn of the Congressional building. He's arrested for stepping onto the lawn. And that was the closest thing to mob rule.
I can't help but draw a connection to a recent event where some people stepped onto that lawn.
Yeah, right.
Go ahead, Al.
Yeah. So you talked a lot about how the term populist has been hijacked, as you mentioned. People, of all stripes saying they're populist. One of the things you mentioned is often the rhetoric that people use. I'm going to fight for the little guy. I'm going to drain the swamp. I'm anti-elitist. Is maybe rhetoric that sounds populist, but when you actually look at their actions or their policy initiatives, their rhetoric doesn't match what they actually do when they're in office.
Right. Absolutely. And that's why I think what we need to talk about is the reality, the political and historical reality of what a particular politician or party is about. They can say anything, and they'll promise the moon. And they'll claim to be on the side of the little guy against, the aristocrats and the limousine liberals and so on. But in fact, if you look at what, for example, Trump did, it was quite the opposite. Whatever he said on behalf of the working man, what he actually did was cut taxes for the super rich, deregulate corporate America, trash any effort to deal with, climate change. And it was actually a series of steps that actually only rewarded corporate America and the modern day robber barons that we need to be concerned about.
Well, remember, first round of tax cuts was designed so that they wouldn't affect the middle or lower class
until
after the midterm elections,
Right.
even though they were designed to do that.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, Alan.
You
Right.
talk about regulation a lot as well, and we haven't really hit that one yet. So it was dangerous to be a railway employee during this time, right? People were getting injured, people were getting killed, and there was literally no regulation to force these businesses to have safe work environments.
No, it's astonishing what passed for acceptable behavior by corporate executives. These railroad companies were constantly, by the way, in bankruptcy, and constant levels of danger for both passengers and also workers. And there's in the book, the book, by the way, is illustrated. So there's photographs and drawings and cartoons from the era. And one of them is a picture of a railroad accident with, something like 23 people killed in that particular accident. The employer said, well, it was sabotage. The workers and the local townspeople said they never maintained the rails. They simply gave way. And this was characteristic across the board. In the year 1891, 25,000 railroad workers were injured, and 2,600 were killed. 2,600 were killed on the job. And that means just an extraordinary level of indifference and a high level of profiteering that meant if we're going to provide the extraordinary dividends to the stockholders, we're going to cut on maintenance. We're going to cut on all of the safety features that might actually save lives, both workers but also consumers who are actually buying tickets to travel from A to B. And they're doing so in a context where there was an extraordinary level of indifference to the outcomes for many, many of these railroads that were so thoroughly mismanaged. In fact, it was so bad that when the United States entered World War I in 1917, the private profiteering railroad system was so inept and so dysfunctional that it simply collapsed. They could not handle the sudden jump in freight and passenger service, moving troops and individuals and dealing with all of the necessity of mobilizing for a wartime economy. The railroad system simply collapsed because these different corporate entities were so focused on their immediate profiteering that they would not share rolling stock. They would not open up terminals to another railroad. They were looking to maximize the profit. And so the government had to take over the railroad system in World War I. That's how poorly these systems were run. We often hear about, well, the robber barons and corporate executives, at least they're efficient. They weren't. They were efficient actually at shaking down customers and abusing workers. But I don't see them as a particularly positive bunch. And if you look at their actual behavior, many investors today would have a serious difficulty finding the money they would want to give to the likes of Jay Gould, for example. Jay Gould, when he was the CEO of the Union Pacific, would short his own company's stock. Now, for investors, that means what he was doing was borrowing stock of Union Pacific secretly, borrowing that stock. Then he would announce that Union Pacific was facing all kinds of difficulty and so on. And they were probably not going to be able to maintain their level of profitability. Well, so the stock would decline in value. And then when he had to give the stock back, he could buy it at that lower price in the market. He would have initially taken it at the higher price, sells it right away, and then buys it back when he has to return it to the stockbroker he borrowed it from. It's now illegal. It's certainly illegal.
Especially in your own company, yes.
Right.
Yes.
Back then, or watering your stock, meaning you would just keep running the presses and running off, new stock issues when the money wasn't going into new rails, wasn't going into new terminals, wasn't going into new rolling stock. It was going into their pockets. They would simply run off and that by the way, again, is illegal. So what the Populists were calling for were things that were necessary and had to be done. Even if you're pro-capitalist, what they were about was a different kind of private enterprise system. They wanted collective private action. That might sound a little strange. What they were about was co-ops. They wanted cooperatively owned, where the farmers would own their own mill, would own their own warehouse, would collectively combine their crops so that they had more bargaining power in this global system. Likewise, they wanted workers to actually collectively own the factory so that they were the ones making the wagons or the farm implements or whatnot. That was their model. They started hundreds and hundreds of these co-ops. It was very difficult to sustain them because the banks often would not loan them money because they regarded them as ideological outliers, and so they were marginalized in that respect. But they had in mind private initiative in a collective form. Private initiative through a co-op collectively owned by the people actually doing the work. And I think that's a pretty positive.
And if you had the capital to write it out, you could undercut them at every level and just wait until they go out of business, which is what happened also a lot of the time.
Often enough. What would happen, they would start a co-op store to offer goods at a lower price. The neighboring commercial and profit-making enterprises would temporarily undersell the co-op, which didn't have a whole lot of capital. These are for people who are poor. And so they're mustering the upfront capital to get these things off the ground was very difficult. Bankers would not lend them money. And that's why they ultimately said, by the way, it should be the federal government that supports co-ops. And that again happened in the 1930s.
Yeah.
It happened in the 1930s in rural America, where the New Deal government said to the private profit-making utilities, please extend your power lines into rural America because they did not have electricity. And the private profit-making utilities said, no, we don't want to do that. There's not enough customers for that to be profitable. So the government established a different program of rural electric cooperatives. And today, across a lot of the Midwest, you will find in rural areas still there are remnants of that system of companies providing where the customers actually own the enterprise and operate it not to maximize profitability for distant absentee stockholders, but to do the best possible job for the people who collectively own the company as a co-op.
Yeah, I think that even extended to things like cell phone towers and internet access. They kind of did a similar thing. Yeah.
I don't think our audience needs the explanation of the gold standard. However, can you talk about the context of that with the history of American populism?
Okay, I'll try. I'll try and make it comprehensible. I did this in the book, and I used pictures of the preceding money system because before the Civil War, there was no official U.S. paper currency. The only paper currency before the Civil War was what banks would issue as their private label. So you'd get a $1 bill from the Bank of Cincinnati, or you could get a $2 bill from the Bank of Cleveland. And there were hundreds of these private label bank issued currencies floating around. And you had no idea whether that bank in Cincinnati had subsequently gone belly up, because they periodically and frequently were in bankruptcy. So the money was worthless often enough. It was fluctuating in value wildly. During the war, they had to establish a government-backed currency, the greenbacks, as they call them. And unlike before the war and for many years afterwards, where you had what was called redeemable paper currency. You could, in other words, go into a bank and you would say, here's my $10 bill. Give me $10 worth of gold coins. That's the gold standard. That there had to be enough gold to back up the routine demand of customers coming in on a daily basis to redeem their paper currency for those gold coins. Well, of course, anytime the economy heads south or there's any kind of political turmoil, a lot more people show up wanting to turn in their $10 bills for those gold coins. And often enough, the banks didn't have enough gold. They would go bankrupt. Or periodic, what they called them panics, where periodically people's worries about the economy or international affairs or war, whatever the crisis, people would show up at the banks to turn in their money for gold. And the banks would go belly up. Over and over, this was happening in American history. And what was also happening was that if you can only issue paper currency backed by gold, and if gold is scarce, well, that means so is the paper currency. You can only issue so much of it, and usually they're issuing more than they could even afford. But even then, there was still a scarcity of money, and so the interest rates are higher because there's not much of it. So interest rates are high. Banks kind of like that. They'd rather be paid back in gold-based currency anyway. And so what the populists were saying was, look, during the war, we issued money that was based on the power of the government to back it up. And that's the system we have now. That's what we routinely do. The populists said that's what the economy should be based on. And in the 1930s, that's again what happened. We went off the gold standard. Partially. Nixon finished the job decades later. But
now we have fractional reserve and we're not even attached to the Saudis anymore. But that's
right. And I still have a lot of problems with the banking system, but at least we're no longer focused on that fetish that gold is the only measure of value. The populists, by the way, we're saying we could do greenbacks, but we should also expand the money supply by at least monetizing more silver. And so that was another thing that they were characteristically identified with. And there were what happened, and maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but what happened was that the populists, while they had a lot of initial success as a third party, they elected 50 members of Congress.
I wanted to hear you say that. Yeah, talk about some of their excesses in this context.
Right, and they elected 6 governors. They elected hundreds of local officials, including some mayors. Adolf Sturrow in San Francisco was a populist when he was elected in the 1890s. And a lot of folks were galvanized by this new approach, saying these abuses are not something we have to tolerate. And finally, in the Democratic Party, in 1896, William Jennings Bryan, who was a Democrat, but he could see what was happening. And he also figured out that if the Democrats didn't respond to this, the populists were going to keep gaining momentum and eventually establish themselves as one of the dominant parties. And so what Bryan did was he said, well, all right, I'm going to cherry pick certain aspects of the populist platform, including monetizing silver to expand the money supply and reduce interest rates. And that's what he ran on in 1896. He wasn't a populist. A lot of people jokingly called him a popocrat because he had selectively taken part of the populist platform. But if you think about it, even the Republicans started to change. They developed a new movement within the Republican Party. And this sounds counterintuitive today, but they called themselves Progressive Republicans. And they were a powerful part of the Republican Party. And by 1912, there's 4 candidates for president. 3 of them called themselves progressive and had adopted different aspects of what the populists had been calling for in the 1890s, breaking up the corporate monopolies, eliminating the gold standard. That didn't happen quite yet, but votes for women, election of senators, and so on. All of those that's happened around that World War I period. And so the populists, in effect, changed the political terrain of the United States. And that's what I find exciting about this book is that we're trying to say in a shorthand way, this is what actually happened. This is who the populists really were. Not, by the way, because I think we should rehabilitate the term. I think it's been spoiled, frankly. And we should be talking about whatever makes sense in terms of how people want to describe what they're about. Some people see the populists as being sort of proto-socialists. Actually, the major socialist opinion within the Populist Party, they called themselves Christian socialists. They said Jesus was a commoner. He was an agitator. He was a radical. He was a carpenter. He was a worker. And so
both money lenders.
Right. And so there was a notion that this was a spiritual movement as well. But they were open to any religion, Catholic, Jewish, Protestant. They were non-sectarian in that regard. Adolf Sturrow, who was the popular mayor of San Francisco, was a German Jewish immigrant to the United States. So they were open to a wide range of opinion, and it was a very big tent arguing that something had to be done to change our industrial system so that it actually would be focused on the majority, the needs of the majority, workers and consumers.
So by 1896, that was essentially sort of the end of the populist movement, at least nationally, right? There were still local
or the high watermark.
Yeah, that was kind of the high watermark. And the people that had been part of that populist movement essentially merged into the other 2 parties, primarily Democrats, but also some Republicans, as you said, although they eventually came over as well, right?
Well, actually, you're right. They went into the Republican Party as progressive Republicans. Right. The La Follettes in Wisconsin are the best known measures of that movement. They also were important in terms of the election of Woodrow Wilson in 1912. That was a lot of former populists who identified with him. Some of the white populists in the South went back into the Democratic Party and signed up with the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a diaspora across the whole political spectrum. A lot of them ended up in the Socialist Party. Eugene Debs, who was the presidential candidate of the Socialist Party, was a former populist. He and Clarence Darrow in 1894 were big organizers of the Populist Party in Chicago. And so it's across the board. There's Republicans, there's Democrats. A lot of them went into the Prohibition movement, which was also successful in the World War I era. But that was considered a reform movement. A misplaced one, I would argue, but that's another story.
It was considered progressive at the time.
You know, I don't often get to ask people that know as much as you do on the subject. What is your opinion of William Jennings Bryan? Is he a sincere person to you, or was he an opportunist?
I think he was a sincere person. I do. I think, that isn't to say that he didn't take the chances when they were offered to him. He, for example, accepted money from the silver mining companies.
Yeah. Right.
But he actually believed that silver should be monetized. I see him as a canny and effective politician who had a sort of base identification with the politics that he promoted. I mean, he came out against strike breaking, his opponents in the established part of the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. There was massive strike breaking in this period. And usually what that meant was the army would show up, lock and load, and open fire.
Or Pinkertons.
And that happened often enough. Those were the spectacular big moments of suppression of labor. And Bryan said, no, there should not be any court injunctions. It was what they did to break the National Railroad strike was unacceptable. He was in favor of higher taxes for corporations and the wealthy, a graduated income tax. He said, not all of us can afford to pay what we need to pay and what's fair to pay. He wanted some of the land that had been given to the railroad companies returned to the public. And so on. He was not in favor of the sub-treasury plan. He was not in favor of public ownership of the railroads at that time, although 10 years later, he did actually endorse public ownership of the railroads and other monopolies. He said, why should monopolies be owned by private profit-maximizing corporations? They're natural monopolies, utilities he's talking about, and railroads. They should be run for the public benefit.
Can I ask you a question? I've read some critiques about the sub-treasury plan, and I don't want to put you on the spot about it, but I wonder what you think about them. So people say that it would have encouraged production without controls, and that could have in turn glutted the market itself and tanked prices.
I think that's true. And by the way, when I talk about the populists, they were offering the first steps in regulating and thinking through what needed to be done. That doesn't mean their initial draft was always the best way to approach it. But I think that was one problem. And when that system was implemented in the 1930s, it was matched with production controls. In other words, if you wanted to get that low-cost loan from the government with your crop as collateral, you had to agree to not produce any more than you would produce last year, because otherwise it's just a free money sort of system.
Right.
And so for decades, that system worked. It was not one that actually agribusiness corporations favored, particularly the processors. They want the lowest possible cost. And so they're quite prepared to drive farmers out of business to reduce it to the bare minimum of those who can match the narrow margins demanded by all of the major food processors. And that's why farmers these days are increasingly beleaguered, except for the biggest among them. There are some who own quite a bit of property, and they get away with economies of scale. Bill Gates is one of them. He owns 240,000 acres of farmland. He's now the biggest farmland owner in the United States.
Well, there goes a trivia question for our next show, Alan.
Actually, he's not the biggest landowner, though. The biggest landowner is Jeff Bezos, owner of the Washington Post, but a lot of his land, I think it's something like 400,000 acres, is timber.
Wow.
Oh, I would have thought it was all
Washington,
that space land in Texas.
Yeah,
probably some of that too.
Yeah.
How much impact did the populists have on the formation of the Antitrust Act?
Thank you.
In your opinion?
That actually, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890. That's the same year in which the Populists appear initially in Kansas and Nebraska. They had become a national party in 1892, but there is the same year as the Sherman Antitrust Act is being passed. And what's happening is that in the preceding late 1880s, there's a groundswell of a revulsion against what the robber barons were about. And it's what produces the Populist Party, but it also produces a bare majority in Congress for passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is a very weak bit of legislation. And a lot of people have argued that it was really done to sort of mollify public opinion. And whatever teeth it had were almost immediately extracted by Supreme Court judgments that weaken the law even further. So it was actually...
Well, I've never heard of anything
That
like
sounds
that.
very familiar.
You can imagine that. There was continuing call for breaking up these monopolies, and it had to be done through a series of amendments to the Sherman Act and additional legislation, plus some major court cases that broke up Standard Oil, for example. And there's a wonderful case of like, the efficiency of this era of corporate leadership. Rockefeller made his money because he actually colluded with the railroads to make sure that they would charge higher prices to his competitors, give him a lower price, and he would in turn commit all of his shipment to those cooperating railroads. And as he got more and more railroads signed on, his competitors found that it was impossible to transport oil in anything remotely like a competitive manner. And there were other things he was doing. But to me, this notion that, it was just efficiency and that's how they gained their market advantage. Well, no, actually, some of it was just stealing.
Well, I mean, he started off at the very beginning by cartelizing the oil industry. So, I mean, like, even...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, as these competitors would become beleaguered and unable to compete, he would buy them up.
Yeah.
And so eventually he had something on the order of 70 to 80% of the market. And, this was becoming characteristic across the board. And when McKinley defeated Bryan in 1896, McKinley was the Republican candidate running against Bryan, calling him a populist, even though Bryan never acknowledged that the populists actually endorsed him. He ran as a Democrat.
But he did do that Cross of Gold speech.
Yes, that's right. That was the dramatic moment where he said we should not allow the bankers to crucify the working class on a cross of gold.
And he stuck his arms out.
Right, with his arms out, right. But what followed, 1897 to 1905, is the most intense period of corporate concentration in American history. And it was because they had defeated the populists, and now they had, for a time being, free reign. It was so extraordinary and obscene profiteering that actually it produced in turn a progressive movement that actually became the dominant power in both the Democrats and the Republicans. They were both running progressive candidates against each other, trying to outdo which one's actually going to do the most to constrain and restrain corporate abuse.
The most so far. We can see what kind of corporate conglomerations we can get in the future. Can you tell the story about this one? Was fascinating to me because I thought the Scout was a great alternative to the Ford Bronco. Can you talk about the story of International Harvester?
Actually, the Harvester had an interesting history. They first appear as a combination of previously competing companies that were all building farm equipment, harvesting equipment. And they get together in 1890 as the Harvester Corporation. And they last about 4 months because then in Kansas and in Nebraska, out of nowhere comes this new movement that sweeps the elections in both states, the congressional elections, and eventually in Kansas, they elect the governor and they control the state house for a brief moment. Likewise in Nebraska. And it's at that point that Harvester, facing political backlash and court suits, actually dissolves that initial effort to create a countrywide conglomeration of previously competing companies. They back off, And it doesn't happen until 10 years later, a little more than 10 years later, after McKinley defeats William Jennings Bryan, and the Popocrats lose in 1896. And for a time, it looks like there's going to be a consolidation of this oligarchy, this corporate control. That's when International Harvester reappears with over 80% of the market controlled by one company.
Wow. I want to move it into more of the modern day here now. So as somebody who spent, decades within the labor movement, writing about the history of the labor movement, what do you think of the state of the current modern day labor movement? And if it's not as great as we want it to be, is it Reagan's fault?
I don't, I would identify a lot, a wider range of folks I would identify as contributing to the decline.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is Bill Clinton, by the way, and NAFTA.
Yeah.
And NAFTA, by opening the floodgates of offshoring investment, it was already there. It didn't create it, but it definitely amplified it. Gave factory owners a whip hand. All they had to do in any bargaining with a union, if it was already unionized, or with the workforce that might be thinking about a union, is show up with some travel brochures for Mexico, and you scare the bejesus out of people, fearful for their jobs. So even before the companies leave, they've already managed to hammer down conditions and pay through the fear that people have that the company will move. And so I wouldn't just say it was Reagan alone. It was Carter also who deregulated airlines and trucking. Right. Trucking used to be a high wage, a fine way to make a living. And it became
like a monkey and a case of Coors Light in the back that you need to, or that was just regular Coors. Never mind.
Well, they become sweatshops on wheels now.
Right. Yeah.
And there's very little regulation, and that's Carter. And Reagan likewise, deregulation. It's a bipartisan indifference to working people. And that's what I love about Bernie Sanders, is that he brings a voice at a national level that's loud and clear, making the alternative argument for policies that would actually address the needs of working people, both as consumers and also on the job. So I would also, by the way, with respect to labor, I think there's a lot of, we got to look in the mirror. And over many, many years, the labor movement was focused on a really short-term, protective, dig in your heels and hunker down and try and protect your little area, your little collective bargaining world, as opposed to a broader movement that sees the need for organizing workers across the board and cooperating, different groups of workers cooperating together. That's hard to do, by the way. There's nothing easy about it. But instead, what we had was people, instead of running a labor movement, were basically running almost like an insurance company, arguing that, vote for us for a union office and we'll provide you with better benefits. It was like, you're almost choosing an insurance company as opposed to a galvanizing force for changing what America's about. And I think that's what we need, is a labor movement and I think there's some hopeful signs in that regard, that people are recognizing that it's got to be a movement that sees an alliance of working people across the board in terms of voting, but also in terms of direct action on the job and supporting people's efforts to organize and fight for better pay and benefits, and actually freedom and protection on the job.
So talking about maybe some improvements in the labor movement, how do you feel about Shawn Fain, the head of the UAW? He's come to more prominence, I would say, in the last few years. Seems like he's had a few wins. How do you think he's doing? Is he potentially the face of the new labor movement?
Potentially, yes. But it's a big tent right now in the UAW, sure. And there's a lot of opinion about which way the union should go. I'm encouraged by the fact that there's a growing number of people who think the way to proceed is by bold action that goes right at the points that previously were considered our weakness. We've got to organize the South. So long as that's available to employers, that's where they're going to go. And that's not a an easy row to hoe. But I think Sean Fain is about actually developing that kind of approach. And the strike he ran last year was outstanding, I thought. I thought it was a brilliant strategy, and he did the right thing. He made the corporations who had been, 15 years ago, it was the union that took concessions to help get them back on their feet.
Yep,
right.
They've become then extraordinarily profitable, billions of dollars in profits, and they're still arguing that auto workers should remain marginalized, really, in terms of who was benefiting from that extraordinary recovery of the industry. And so Sean Fain is saying, no more two-tier. You can't be paying workers for different amounts of money for doing the same work. A single tier. And we need to recover some of the ground we lost in those past concessions. It's interesting to me, by the way, that the reason, you remember not so long ago, the UAW won the election at Volkswagen in the South, but then they lost at Mercedes.
Right.
What happened at Mercedes? They called for the elimination of a CEO who was abusive and disrespectful of workers, and they called for the elimination of the multiple tiers by which workers doing the same job, roughly speaking, were being paid very different amounts of money. What did the company do right before the election? They fired the CEO and they eliminated the tiers. Now, you can say, well, the union lost, but let's think that through. Actually, the workers there also got, by the way, a massive double-digit wage increase to try to, they didn't come close to matching what Sean Fain and the UAW won in Detroit, but there was some ground covered. Eliminate tiers, raise wages, get rid of the abusive CEO. Did the workers really lose? Well, they lost the election, but they actually won something substantial. And I think that's a lesson that we need to keep in mind when we look at the larger picture.
All right, we got just a few more for you here, and we'll get you out of here. Dustin, you have a couple you want to hit?
Yeah, I think a couple of these I could skip, but I wanted to ask you this one. You don't shy away from Trump in your book. I think feel free to talk about Trump in this question, but what do you make of Vance? On paper, he says he's a fan of Lena Khan and antitrust versus tech, but he's also changed his opinion on notable things before. So
no, he's a weather vane.
Yeah.
Now you're in Michigan and Eastern Ohio. I know how that goes, but
right. But he's no hillbilly. Let's make that clear. This is a guy who was managing stock portfolios for Silicon Valley investors. He's a graduate of Yale Law School. As he was growing up in a troubled family, without a doubt, but it wasn't economic poverty. This is a guy who had golf lessons when he was a kid. So the notion that he qualifies as some representative of a working class opinion is, I think, absurd. He's an Ivy Leaguer and a stock investor, and that's who he is. He'll mouth whatever is necessary to give the impression that he's something else, but it's no more convincing to me than it is in the case of Donald Trump.
Yeah, I don't think so. That's pretty much my take on him as well. If you don't know anything about this one, feel free. It's a shot in the dark, but I've been reading about this a lot lately. Are you familiar with techno-feudalism?
No.
Okay, it's kind of the concept that we are presently leaving capitalism, or we already have, and the technocrats own the new domain, and we are the best you can be as a feudal merchant underneath their owned domains. But I won't ask you to talk about something you're not well versed in. I can ask you one more thing about your book that's sort of niche, and I've got a chance to talk to the author. I noticed you called it the War of 1898 and not the Spanish-American War. I think I get that. Can I hear why you chose to frame it that way?
Because actually the Cubans were fighting the Spanish long before the United States entered it. And it's a kind of a U.S.-centric way. And it's also, by the way, if it neglects the fact that in the case of the Philippines, after the U.S. defeated Spain, the Filipinos, like the Cubans, had been in an insurrection against the Spanish colonial power, and they wanted their own country. And the U.S. refused to grant them that possibility. And in fact, then proceeded to suppress the Filipino movement in a brutal way. Concentration of the population in these protected villas, and massive starvation and disease as a result. Somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million die. 15,000 Filipino fighters for their own independence are killed by the U.S. So it's the War of 1898. To me, it's a many-cornered struggle involving the Cubans, the Filipinos, the U.S., the Spanish, and so.
Yeah. And in reality, the War of 1898 is the time period that we think of when we talk about that war. But the duration of it was largely the suppression of the Filipinos. I agree.
Correct. Yes, and then of course multiple crises with our control of Cuba, which was contested by the Cubans and challenged repeatedly.
Well, that got resolved, thank God, though. So
yeah.
And then we named that mountain after McKinley. So
right. There we go.
So I have two things that we normally end our show with. The second one, I think, is a little bit more humorous. Let me just ask you, I want to put a bumper at the beginning of the show that says, "Hi, this is Steve Babson, author of The Forgotten Populists, and I never listen to None Taken." Do you mind giving us one of those?
And I what?
So our show's None Taken. It's sort of, what do you call that?
Self-deprecating.
Self-deprecating.
Yeah.
So I never listen to None Taken.
Every time we do an interview, we have the interviewee say that.
Yeah.
Okay. Wait, None Taken. Okay. Which is, by the way, an interesting title. It took me a while to figure out what that was about.
It's sort of like, me and Alan have slightly different opinions. I didn't say it at all earlier, but I am a reformed libertarian. So I've loved talking to you. Me 10 years ago would have been a real pain in the ass and wrong about a lot of it. But that's kind of the point of None Taken, is like we can disagree and have a productive conversation.
Yep.
Okay, None Taken.
Oh, can you say this is Steve Babson?
No, I was just using.
Okay.
This is Steve Babson. I am the author of Forgotten Populists: When Farmers Turn Left to Save Democracy, and I have never listened to None Taken.
Perfect. First take.
One take.
Alan, ask him the last question.
All right. So one question we always ask every guest: what's the dumbest thing you've ever done?
We need another hour.
That's a good life, man.
That's a good time.
Geez.
What's the first one that comes to mind?
Yeah, just
let's think. Taking that last drink when I really should have just been walking away, and not some very nasty things happened afterwards. So
that's fair. I think we've all been adjacent to that place.
When I lived in Detroit, I knew a guy that ended up getting his 6th DUI, and that was what was finally the
right. I've had to learn portion control.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Wise.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Steve. Really enjoyed the book. Everybody check that out, The Forgotten Populists. I believe your website for that is theforgottenpopulist.com, right?
Yes, and that, by the way, there's also a video on there that people might enjoy. It's a 7-minute video. You go on the homepage, you gotta, go down a little bit, but the video's there. It might be worth a look.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for your time, man.
Thanks a lot.
Take care. Have a great night.
You too.
Thank you.
I'm gonna stop recording.
All right, we're good. Thank you so much, Steve.